sign, most visible sign of God's invisible grace is when Jesus came on earth and lived his life. All through the Old Testament, he sends prophet after prophet after prophet. And how many times did they get it? They got it for a while, and they took a step backwards. It took Jesus to come down to help them understand what God wanted for us, his love for us. And then it's these 12 guys that Jesus called, and they responded, the apostles. Now, how many times did they get it? Yeah. They're sitting there side by side. I'm hoping Don's got a better success rate with his students than Jesus did with the apostles, okay? I mean, we think we get it, but these guys, it was his message was so radical that it was hard for them to understand it. Love your enemy. Well, nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, man, I wish Gil was here for a big hug, you know? I mean, that's not going to happen. That's not natural to us. If there's someone we don't like, we don't wake up in the morning, our first instinct is, man, that's the guy I want to go have breakfast with. That's not our instinct. So, this concept of the sacramentality of Jesus goes one step further. And then I'll take away from this topic and go to the scripture part. Is that if Jesus is the visible sign of God, then what is the next natural progression?
Where the example of Jesus?
No, if Jesus is to God, he's the visible sign, then
who's the invisible?
Yeah. Now, if Sandy had her way, I would be invisible and she'd be visible. No, the next natural is us. Somebody wrote a book and said, if people don't know you're Catholic, then are you Catholic? Think about that. How many people in your life know that you're Catholic or a Catholic woman? How many people know that? 1, 2, 5, 10, 100? You know, I made a comment yesterday afternoon, I'm the smartest guy in the world. 2 Saturdays out of 4 Saturdays, I'm at church at 7 o'clock in the morning with a bunch of guys, where I could be sleeping in. Okay? If people don't know, can't visualize it, then is it true? And I'm not meaning that you're sitting at a street corner and preaching and doing all that stuff, but what do they think that makes you different? If you think that being Catholic makes you different, then can people actually see that? Are you visible? A lot of you guys are visible. How do I know that? I see you as a lector. I see you as an usher. I see you as an acolyte. I see you as an altar server. I see you here on Saturdays. You are visible, okay? Now, the story I told earlier is that I have other responsibilities. I got a bunch of people working for me. I've got a wife, kids, grandkids. Yesterday, I told Sandy last night, I said, we're not doing anything Catholic tonight except loving each other. You cannot have the BlackBerry on. Believe it or not, Sandy gets emails basically 24 hours a day for people wanting stuff. And I want then that doesn't only mean the staff, that means the parishioners as well. I said, I want you to have a St. Catherine free evening. I was up here Monday through Thursday, well, one night we had dinner, but we were doing St. Catherine type stuff 4 days in a row. And last night had to be a St. Catherine free night for balance in my life. And I'm not ashamed of saying that. What day is Father Matthew's day off? Tuesday. Okay. Even Jesus had a day off, right? Yeah, except when he healed a couple of lepers or whatever he did. The idea is that you're supposed to be visible. You're supposed to be a sacrament with a small s. Okay? So my natural instinct, like I said before, if I touch this book, I get struck by lightning. It is not my natural instinct to pick this book up. I'm sorry to admit, I don't do this on a daily basis. Sandy does, I don't. I do other things, but this is not my strength. And my natural inclination is to go to which part of the Bible?
New Testament.
New Testament. In the early church, there were a lot of people that said, the heck with the Old Testament. Jesus is the real deal. That's all we care about. Could we, as Catholics, only have the New Testament? Okay. The Old Testament's hard for me. Like Sandy's taking the scripture study, and it's in the book of Hebrews. So I'm going, Hebrews, those were the old guys, right? That's got to be the Old Testament. No, it's letters to the Hebrews. So the key point I want to make, and ironically I told this story the other night about this guy who was Protestant, and he became Catholic. And what got him, what turned him over to the top to become Catholic was a word that I wasn't familiar with. I hope I like this right. Typology. I know Mark probably understands this word. What happened was he had this revelation, and having a very strong background, biblical background, had never really put this together, was that the Catholic Church knows how the Old Testament and the New Testament works together. A lot of guys in this room are going to say, man, Lyndon, I don't read this thing. I don't know the Bible. I can't quote script. I can't quote verses. But you made the comment, how much of the Mass comes from Scripture? Now, I don't know the percentage, but the answer is a lot. This man who became Catholic did his doctorate thesis connecting these two scriptures. And what sent him over the top was he went to Mass one day, on Sunday, and the first reading was, and the gospel reading was, and he almost passed out. He goes, I worked 2 years on this, and these guys do it once every 3 years? They must know what's really going on. Don, have you figured out who this guy is yet?
No.
Scott Hunt?
Yeah, Scott Hunt. Yeah. He's one of Don's favorite guys. I can't pronounce your Spanish saying, so I got to stick with it. And I didn't even know this till I finished. I read the story, and at the end it tells me who the author was. The concept was, I always talk about in RCA that it's a call and then there's a response. God's call is always there for us. It's up to us to respond. Sometimes we respond a lot more than other times. What Scott Hahn is saying is that the Old Testament gives us the promise. The New Testament gives us the fulfillment. Okay?
And you know who actually said that hundreds of years before him? St. Augustine.
Yeah. And I was trying to write words down, and, you know, we have the Old Testament. A lot of people say the Old Testament's kind of the salvation story. You've got God trying to talk to these Jewish people, and they go through all these trials and tribulations, and then the New Testament is that salvation realized in Jesus' life, his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. Because guys, you got to remember one thing. Jesus was born, and he lived, and he died as a Jew. And the Old Testament is the story of the Jewish people. Mary, you know, we talk about call and response. We use Mary as an example of response. Every little Jewish gal knew that the Messiah was going to come. That was the promise. She's sitting there, and they're saying, the angel comes down and says, the promise is going to be fulfilled, and you're going to be the vessel. I can't even imagine what that was like. I mean, I like this word vessel. Don was the one that probably got me started on this word vessel, is that you think of your wives, and they've born your children. That's something you cannot experience as a man. Okay? Just not physically possible. And then Don makes tries to make the sensory picture of Joseph holding Jesus. You know, I went to a hospital once, and I held a child within like 2 hours of its birth. And I had this real feeling of I'm not worthy, you know. It was fragile to me.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want. I mean, I felt uncomfortable. I really felt uncomfortable. So I'm thinking, you know, if I felt uncomfortable with a neighbor's child, think of what the instinct would have been for Joseph. Because a lot of you guys have held your own child. So this whole idea of the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament, the Old Testament, you know, gives us the background, I think is important. And that's why, and when you go to Mass, you know, they go, gee, they got the first reading, gee, they got the second reading, gee, they got a psalm in between, and we always, why do we have to have all this stuff? It's to give us that meaning. How many people have been to Easter Vigil? And if you go to the unabridged version of the Easter Vigil, how many readings are there? It could be as many as 9. And there's a reading, then there's a responsorial, then there's a song. A reading, responsorial, and a song. And it goes through, this is the most important evening of the year for the Catholic faith. They want you to appreciate this story. And then, obviously, Jesus' presence is the fulfillment.